Hi.
Henry, how
are
you?
you doing?
I'm
Not
good,
too bad.
I'm good. Welcome to another edition of the award-winning Blogging Heads TV.
Award-winning? Nobody's ever told us.
You just kind of say that, and no one ever checks that stuff. So,
Yeah, well, I suppose there's so many awards out there that it's there's award inflation going on here. We can award it whatever award we want, and then it's
my dad was an advertising agent in St. Louis, and I used to work for him growing up. And we had an account called the Henry VIII Restaurant, and the tagline that he wrote for the Henry VIII that was in all the copy for years and years was that Henry VIII is one of St. Louis's 10 best restaurants. And one day I asked my dad, I said, who said that Henry VIII is one of St. Louis's 10 best restaurants? And he said, I did. And and if you'd asked a St. Louisan back in the 1970s or 80s about Henry VIII, they'd say, isn't that one of St. Louis's 10 best restaurants? So grab the mantle and let others fact check you. Is my motto.
That sounds like a good one to me. It sounds like a good one to me. Anyway, I want to start in by talking about something which I don't think was one of the award-winning moments on Blogging Heads, which was the dialogue between Bob Wright and David Frum, which happened a couple of days ago, in which David effectively accused Mark Schmidt, who he had been engaged in a previous Blogging Heads debate with, of being a sort of latter-day Charles Lindbergh. And this to me seems to be something which was a pretty terrible accusation to make, because Lindbergh is a notorious anti-Semite, a notorious isolationist, and the reason for this was that Mark had very quietly, very politely, being Mark, had said that he found it difficult to engage in the public commemoration of September 11th that was happening because of the way that it had been politicized by people like Bush and Giuliani. And I wonder, what thoughts do you have on that?
Well, I watched that segment, and it was a really odd segment because David Frum was clearly emotional, and it was like he couldn't quite say directly the accusation that was implied. This those who won't publicly display grief and outrage every September 11th are somehow not... it was hard to kind of really precisely follow what he was saying, but it was more of an accusation. But it was almost like he was wrestling with his own feelings about it, and I thought Mark was very kind of quietly explaining, as if he needed to, that the obvious, which is the problem here is not that the country didn't as in unison suffer a sense of outrage. And I remember myself, I was depressed for weeks after that. And we're here in Washington. We went down to the river and watched the smoke rise over the Pentagon, and our office here at the Washington Monthly, a few blocks from the White House, got evacuated, and our mail was taken. It was very personal for a lot of people. But as Mark said, it was pretty much hijacked the sentiments of 9/11 so grossly to a divisive and foolish national security agenda that it I think quickly, for a lot of the country, lost that unifying feeling that it should have had. And I think Mark was describing a kind of sadness, almost outrage, that he had lost this sense of unity. And David was, on the one hand, indicating that was somehow patriotic, but part of him seemed to be kind of conceding that, that had happened.
But the part which I found, and I've met David Frum once, and he seemed an okay guy then, but the part that I found depressing and disturbing about it was that this beating on the chest, how is it that we made Mark Schmidt into a Charles Lindbergh? And that seems to me to be a very not only a somewhat disingenuous way of sort of portraying what is a when he kept on going on about how appalling Mark Schmidt's response was, and this seemed to me to be both rather disingenuous and a really very, very serious accusation. And one of the ways that thinking about it a little bit afterwards, it seemed to me that if you want to accuse somebody of being Charles Lindbergh, and here I'm going to be as generous as possible and forget about the the nasty nastier aspects of Lindbergh's anti-Semitism, his admiration for various aspects of National Socialism and whatever. The kindest possible interpretation here is that David Frum is accusing Mark Schmidt of being some kind of an isolationist, which suggests that basically David Frum's attitude to how to memorialise September 11th is that the only way to memorialise September 11th was to go to war with Iraq, and that those people who didn't go to war with Iraq, or who didn't support going to war with Iraq, didn't support this divisive national security agenda that you talked about, were in some sense being unpatriotic, were being isolationist, were doing the same kinds of nasty, bad things that Lindbergh had done during the run-up to the war, even if Lindbergh actually during the war was more publicly supportive of what happened.
Right. Well, I'm not sure David is, I would quite accuse of this, but the basic trap that is being laid there, and he's not the first to kind of move in that direction, is if you're patriotic, you'll join us in memorializing 9/11, but we're going to control how that's memorialized, and the way we're going to memorialize it is to fuse it with Iraq, and say that if you care about 9/11, you'll support the mission as the president has defined it in Iraq. That's the clever and diabolical rhetorical trick playing on people's patriotism. But let me ask you, did he ever sort of? I saw the broadcast, or the item there on Blogging Heads TV, but did he ever use the term Charles Lindbergh?
Oh yeah.
I guess I missed that.
Yeah.
And did he actually accuse?
He said he said he said something like don't you shouldn't. I can't remember the exact words, but it was something along the lines of "you shouldn't be letting this make you into a Charles Lindbergh." I think was the
yeah. I mean that's just over the top, and it's just outrageous.
Well, when it may well be that this was something perfectly sincere that he was saying. I think that there was some, at the very least, some intellectual dishonesty there, and sort of refusing to come to terms with some of what he was saying. But so what this reminded me of was the quip by that famous old conservative Dr. Johnson about patriotism being the last refugee of a scoundrel. And I'm not saying that David Frum is a scoundrel here, but what I am saying is that there's something, what I think Johnson was identifying here was a way in which people seek to invoke a certain sense of patriotism as a way of ending certain kinds of debates and declaring this is what we share. If you're not with this, and you are ipso facto evil, you are not one of us. If you are, if you are, well then shut up and get with the program.
Right.
And there was some interesting stuff about this. Around Memorial Day a couple of years ago, one of my co-bloggers, Kieran Healy, got an awful lot of stick, including from somebody at the Vala conspiracy, who's one of the most thoughtful conservatives out there, Oren Kerr, when he basically said that we should think about Memorial Day as being a time when we ought to consider whether or not it really makes sense sometimes to go to war. And so he was immediately attacked for politicizing this, despite the fact that on the same day, George Bush had made a speech basically saying we need to memorialize the people who have died by going on and completing the mission that they began. And the end result of this, I think, is really it's pretty clear and pretty obvious. So when you look at memorialization, it's always a political process. There's always politics as a major part of what's happening, and that's not only true of what's happening in the US. If you look, for example, at the very, very bitter debates around, say, the creation of the Yad Vashem memorial to victims of the Holocaust Museum in the US, there always are extremely strong, bitter politics going back and forth between people who want something to be memorialized in one kind of way and people who disagree with a specific interpretation. And I also think this is one of the reasons why, if you look at modern memorials, there's been more and more of a tendency to go towards abstraction as a means of memorializing, when you look at public monuments, because this helps to get away from some of these more vicious and vitriolic debates about how exactly you should memorialize this, that, and the other.
I think that's a very good point, and with almost a kind of documentarian feel to them, I'm thinking of the FDR memorial, not a war memorial, but with I don't know if you've been to it, but it's got just it's almost like going through a newsreel of the times, or the certainly the Vietnam Veterans Memorial with just a listing of the names on a stark black slit of black granite or marble. Well, speaking of memorials, we had this past week, the issue of President Ahmadinejad of Iran wanting to go to the 9/11 memorial and being denied that, but being allowed and indeed invited by Columbia University to come and speak there, which, all of our watchers, our viewers today are familiar with all of that and the fallout from it. But I was wondering, Henry, if you came down one way or another on that, and what you thought of the way Ahmadinejad was treated at Columbia. Was that the right way to treat him, the wrong way to treat him? Should he have been allowed to go to the 9/11 memorial?
I think he should have been allowed to go to the 9/11 memorial, and this is not because I have any particular brief for him. He strikes me as a very creepy and unpleasant and worrying guy. But I think that my reaction to this is a Rick Perlstein reaction, which is to say that if you look back, for example, at when Nikita Khrushchev came to the United States, the U.S. basically allowed him to do a whole bunch of things, and he also he engaged in debate with people like Walter Reuther and other major figures at the time, and this was regarded as being the way that you handled foreign people who A, you disagreed with fundamentally, and B, presented a possible threat to your regime. And it seems to me that the way that Ahmadinejad, if that's how his name is pronounced, I am not Persian pronunciation is not my strong point. The way that he was treated seems to me to suggest a certain kind of either a weakness or a willingness on certain parts of the American right wing in particular, the various newspapers and tabloids who are fulminating against him, to try and buy into a narrative which elevates both him and them at the same time. This narrative of of hostility and not giving the guy an inch. Whereas I think if the U.S. had basically allowed him to do the kind of stuff that he wanted to do in terms of laying a wreath at the 9/11 memorial, I think that this would have been much more effective in the long term in winning the public debate and the public battle within Iran, which is very much a divided society around the stuff that he represents. His allies have suffered some electoral setbacks, and I think that by effectively publicly insulting him at every possible opportunity, this manages to get, I would suspect, although I'm not an expert on the region, if this gets people's backs up, just in the same way as when I think Bush, if Bush were to be publicly insulted or humiliated on a visit to Western Europe, one of the Western European countries that disagreed with him volubly, I think that a whole lot of Americans who disliked him intensely would have felt nonetheless that their country had been insulted, and that this would have perhaps increased support for him.
I think that's absolutely right, and you mentioned the Rick Perlstein piece that goes into great detail to remind us that when Nikita Khrushchev came, he was not slipped into the UN and then forced to leave. He was actually met at the airport by the Eisenhower administration, and they personally took him around to different places, and you had, and so I think the actual problem here is a kind of self-created one created by the Bush administration, because it shouldn't be up to Columbia University or the mayor of New York or whatever to decide how to treat the president of a country that is in some ways a direct enemy of the United States. That's a decision that should be made by the White House and by our elected officials. And if they were sane elected officials, they would recognize that we are in a horrible place in Iraq. We're going to need to engage with Iran. This will happen at some point. And just as Eisenhower understood that it was not in our interest to freeze out Russia, but rather to bring Nikita Khrushchev, who, by the way, had talked about burying us, not another country, an ally, us, and still he had him come to the country and met him at the airport. The right way to have dealt with this was to have been engaged with Iran the whole time, so that it wouldn't be an issue when he came, whether he went to the ground zero or not. But that's not the policy. The policy is to stiff-arm Iran and bring us to the brink of a conflict. This is the neocon sort of way of dealing with our enemies, which is to give them what we used to call in grade school the silent treatment, not talk to them. This is what got us in trouble with North Korea, and we've tried to been backtracking on that ever since. So in a sense, he privatized the problem. He said, well, we're not going to deal with Iran, and now it's up to the president of Colombia to decide that the man ought to have a platform whereby we could hear his views, and then he felt that he needed to kind of diss the guy while he was introducing him. So I think the whole thing was kind of sordid. The end result, as you pointed out rightly so, was to strengthen Ahmadinejad's hand in Iran. I wonder if the Bush administration knows or cares that that was the end result.
Well, to some extent, I think you do get these self-perpetuating dynamics. I'm Irish, and so I'm familiar with what happened in the north of Ireland for a long time, where you saw the extremists on both sides. So every time that peace seemed possibly likely to break out, so somebody would do something horrific to people from the other community in order to prevent that from happening. So you got almost what was a kind of tacit collusion between the extremists on both sides, to keep amping things up. And I think that there's possibly something like this which is happening here, which is that, so what are the U.S. options with regard to Iran? They're not great. So the idea that we are going to go in and we are going to invade Iran, which I think is still festering in some of the neocon circles, is self-evidently crazy given how badly the military is overstretched in Iraq at the moment. And this means, as you say, that sooner or later you have to go in there and you have to engage with them. The U.S. has missed a couple of very good opportunities that it could have used to do this. Europeans have been engaged in a kind of dialogue with the Iranians, which has not been especially successful on the proliferation thing. And one of the things that Europeans say, and this is what I've heard around town from various people who've been involved in this stuff, is that what the Iranians want and what they say time and time again, they don't want to speak to the French or the Germans. They want to speak to the Americans. They want to figure out some sort of a modus vivendi. And
right.
The Iranian regime.
They want the shackles lifted off their economy so that the regime can have something they can give back to their populace. And the Bush administration and the neocon view is let's make the whole country suffer so that the regime will fall. And this was the theory, and it might work. Who knows? I mean, it sort of worked in South Africa, but that the theory that's the theory we've had for Cuba for decades. It's the theory that we've had with North Korea, which led North Korea to grab plutonium and create nuclear weapons because it seems not to be working in Iran either. So it's going to fall to the next president, and I think it's not because there'll necessarily be a theoretical break with that insane policy, though I hope it does. It's just because Iraq will necessitate deep engagement with Iran. If there's any hope of disengaging from Iraq and pulling troops out, it's going to have to be to bring the major players in, and Iran is the major player.
Very definitely, and this is geopolitics as it is. And this is not to say that the Iranian regime is an especially nice regime. It's certainly not to say that even the quote more sort of reasonable people unquote, such as Rafsanjani, are necessarily wonderful people, but it's a fact of the world that the U.S. is not in a position to bring through wide-scale change in Iranian society, and the best it can do is try to find some modus vivendi and try to use that modus vivendi as a means for perhaps more subtle influence over the longer term in order to try and remake what is happening within those societies, or at least to encourage those parts of that society which seem to be more liberalising, more interested in engagement. But this is something which is just completely ruled out of the game. And it's also very interesting to see how the Democratic presidential candidates, all of them have been ducking and weaving on this issue. None of them wanted to face up squarely to what it is that they effectively would have to do if they were in office, because this would be seen as being a sign of weakness, right, a sign of capitulation.
Well, it was ever thus. You don't win by conceding that the United States doesn't have very good bargaining power right now and we ought to cut a deal with our enemy. That's not a winning formula. You win by finding a way to be tougher on the issue of the day. And I know the left hates to hear that, but that's sort of how it usually works. There was this vote on the Lieberman-Kyle amendment this week that was a non-binding resolution calling on the United States to consider labeling the Republican Guards, was it, a terrorist organization? Yeah. Some language that might have been interpreted as a casus belli, or giving the president power to go after Iran militarily, was taken out, and enough Democrats thought that was took the sting out of it enough to get behind this and get tough on Iran. I hope it. I don't know what it means, but there's also a quite smart Steve Clemens piece in Salon the other day, making a pretty interesting counter-conventional case that the Bush administration does not show signs that it is going to do anything militarily on Iran in its waning year in office, which his logic was kind of interesting, and it was worth reading. I don't know if you saw that, but I mean that's a great danger. At this point, we've had so many signs from the Bush administration that at least within the Cheney part of the White House, they would like to clean this nuclear mess up, before they leave, and don't trust the next president to do so. So we shall see.
Well, the other interesting thing, and I've seen some reporting on this in the U.S. papers, but the Financial Times has been better on this, as on many issues of international interest. There seem to be some distinct rumblings emerging from the military about how inadvisable they think a whole bunch of this stuff is. So not saying it quite directly, but making it clear that they believe that the hyping up of tensions with Iran is not a good idea, and presumably they're looking at sort of the kinds of stuff that they believe that they can or cannot do. And so one might see perhaps a somewhat troubling but nonetheless important public confrontation happening if the drums of war keep on being beaten upon by the neoconservatives.
And let us remember that the mainstream military was deeply uncomfortable with the whole idea of invading Iraq, and nevertheless we did. I was wondering if we could move to another issue, kind of get back to domestic politics here a little bit. And I think we've both read the Matt Bide book that a lot of people are talking about, The Argument. Kevin Drum has a review of it in our magazine. I wrote a little bit about it in the magazine. What's your take on that book?
We had to delay our dialogue a little bit, which meant that I could actually finish it, which is, I guess, all to the good. I thought I basically agreed with Kevin Drum's take on the narrative of the book. I thought it was a really fun, really interesting read, and especially the stuff on sort of the Millionaires' Caucus. This is stuff that I hadn't read about, that I hadn't seen reported in any great detail anywhere else.
And we should say to our viewers that this is a book about three different groups within the kind of progressive base. It's bloggers, Move On members, and this group of billionaire liberal kind of outsiders, non-mainstream Democratic funders, called the Democracy Alliance. And Matt Bide of the New York Times Magazine kind of follows these three groups over the course of the 2 years after the defeat of John Kerry in 2004, and their attempts to stiffen the spines of the Democrats on Capitol Hill and to to kind of formulate a new progressive agenda for the next Democratic president to run on.
Well, as I say, I think it's a very, very good and very interesting book.
Yeah, I thought it was a terrific read.
Yeah. I do have some small criticisms and one major criticism of, I think, the underlying agenda of the book, which you may agree with, you may not agree with. First of all, the smaller criticism is that I thought that some of the stuff on the Netroots, on the blogs of Netroots, was a little tone deaf. Which is to say, there's one bit where he describes this speech by Mark Warner, where so Mark Warner says a lot of things that the Netroots should be happy about, but then he says something about Iran and so how we need to be tough on Iran, and the Netroots basically start exploding into they start criticizing, they start disagreeing, they start pushing him on this. And Bai's take on this is that this is evidence that the Netroots, that they focus on the one small little place in which Mark Warner agrees with George Bush, and they go after that because they're blindly partisan. And I think that's flat out wrong. My interpretation of that, which I think from studying this stuff and from talking to these people, is that the main reason that most of these people got involved in this in the first place was because of the Iraq War and the perceived spinelessness and cravenness of the Democrats on the Iraq War. And so when they see a Democrat seeming to give comfort to the regime, to the Bush administration on a possible future war, this is naturally going to be something which is going to touch their sorest and weakest spots. So what I think Bai portrays as being blind partisanship, I think actually is something which touches directly and immediately on the major mobilizing issue that got these guys involved in this in the first place.
I think that's right. I mean, on our own blog, we have a lot of commenters who would take the same view that to suggest a kind of tough line on Iran in a way that seemed to be making the Bush-Cheney policies easier to do. In other words, giving them cover is the worst possible thing a Democrat could do, and it's not that and we could debate exactly what we think of a Democrats' Iran policy should be, and I do think that there's a kind of quick trigger there but the basic idea is, look, the way that we got into Iraq was that people on the left who were considered legitimate spokesmen and said, well, maybe they're right about Iraq and their weapons of mass destruction, and that gave cover for an insane policy. And so even if you think Iran is a terrible dilemma, and we should be very, very careful in brushing them back and taking a relatively hard line, you can't say that in a way that gives any cover for the Bush administration. And this is the kind of dilemma that all Democrats find themselves in. And it's a legitimate one. That said, it depends on the person. If Wes Clark is a great favorite of the Netroots, as was Mark Warner, maybe more so, and he takes a reasonably hard line on the Iran question, and doesn't seem to garner the same outrage because there's a sense that people have in the net that they can trust him to give a hard line in a way that is sensible, and that actually provides a kind of deterrent effect, gives progressives and Democrats a way forward that doesn't kind of support a conservative meme, as it said. So it's a weird kind of line that you can't cross in the Netroots.
Yeah, no, well, I think that probably, as you suggest here, a lot of this did also translate into Netroots people being a lot more suspicious, perhaps, about Mark Warner than they might have been about somebody like Wesley Clark. But here I want to get to where I think is the most interesting bit of the book, and the bit that I disagreed with, and the bit that you've talked about a little bit in this month's Washington Monthly. Kevin Drum has a bit about it as well. And this is the idea behind Bai's book is that the Democrats are still in search of the big idea, this big thing that's going to allow them to transform themselves, to present themselves in a unified fashion to the public. So basically to do what the Conservatives did in the 1960s and to cohere their ideology into something that connects with the public and allows them to reshape politics in some important and significant ways. And so you and Kevin both have the same take on this, which is, well, at least as I read you guys, which is, well, maybe we don't need the big idea all that much. A set of policy tools, use of good ideas, good judgment about which ideas work is really what we're looking for. And I think that there's a lot of wisdom to that. And yes, I'm a wonkish kind of person myself, so this naturally appeals to me. But I also think that there's something, that Bide is onto something when he talks about the ways in which you really manage to pull the centre of American politics in a different direction than it has been, and that the Conservative movement had been extremely successful in doing that over the last 20 or 30 years. And here I'll refer back to Rick Perlstein's book on the Goldwater movement, and also to this little pamphlet he wrote, the stock ticker and the super jumbo, which basically argues that the Democrats need to do the same thing. But I disagree with Bide. Bide basically seems... Well, why don't I let you talk first, and then I'll talk about why I disagree with Bide, rather than why I may disagree with you.
Well, I guess, as somebody who has spent a lot of years searching for big policy ideas that I think would work and would, be helpful to politicians, both substantively and politically, has been on kind of the same search that Matt Bai has been. He leaves sort of frustrated with liberals and the base for their inability to come up with this pure, perfect formulation. And I understand the frustration, but I think, as Kevin said, maybe there's a lesson there. Maybe that should tell you something. And what I would suggest is, look, you're looking for something that doesn't maybe exist, which is a bumper sticker big idea that can unite all the issues and all the wings of the progressive kind of community and America generally behind sort of one or two or three big ideas. And maybe part of the reason is a lot of the problems that we have, that we're facing today, if you think about it, are dangerous over-reliance on oil, stagnant wages and deepening inequality of income, growing the cost of health care, war and instability in the Middle East. These are problems in general that we had back in the 70s and 80s. These are not new problems. And the truth is that the Democrats as well as plenty of Republicans have been toying around with and proposing and thinking about and writing about solutions to these problems for years, and we've got stacks of ideas that could be deployed here. What we've been unable to do is implement any of them because we've gone through a period of 30 years of conservative ascendancy, where you have a kind of far-right ideology that's been adopted by what has been until recently the majority Republican coalition, and in cahoots with a very powerful money-rising corporate and wealth sector, and we haven't been able to pass very much. It doesn't mean that the ideas that have been circulating for years wouldn't work, and what it means is it's really hard to know what the big new idea is. You haven't tried 50 other old ideas yet. So I think that's kind of the dilemma we're in. We've got plenty of ideas laying around, and the secret to leadership here in progress, in addition to kind of first just getting power, is selecting just the right ideas, some of which will probably be variations on old ideas, some of which may be novel, but basically, if you look at, for instance, the various healthcare proposals out of all the Democratic candidates, they're novel combinations of basically ideas that have been around for a long time, and everybody's trying to tweak these ideas, and it goes over most people's heads. The key to this is it's not that policy wonkery isn't important, it's that if you're looking for some big, bold breakthrough idea, that probably is an illusion, and better to recognize what we really need, which is a leader that can articulate the big issues and the solutions well, and send the message out. Look, these are abiding problems. We think we know the solutions. Let's move forward.
Well, I think, okay, well, let me talk about where I agree with Bai and disagree with you, or at least, I don't know that we entirely disagree, but I think that we can at least clarify this a little bit, and it'll be useful, is that I think that, what Bai is talking about was big ideas. I understood this less as being we need to come up with novel new policy solutions, as we need to come up with a way to translate those policy solutions into a coherent agenda that's going to going to create a major coalition for change around it. And this, I think, is where the Democrats still are somewhat lacking. And this is, I think, what you're referring to a little bit with how you say that we need to have a leader who can articulate this stuff. I think what Bai is looking for is, to some extent, some way of bringing this stuff together. But I think only to some extent, because I also think there's some stuff that Bai says which I disagree with, and which I think is kind of naive. I don't know, have you been following the Talking Points memo book club debate around Bai's book?
I should have been. I know it's there, but I haven't read very much. No.
Well, okay, it's pretty interesting, because Mark Schmidt picked to mention his name again, Mark Schmidt wrote a piece which picked up what was my major objection to the Bai book, which is he says virtually nothing about what kinds of big ideas there should be, and then when he mentions one, it's basically why should Democrats be so attached still to the idea of social security? So basically we should put social security on the table, and we should think about fundamental reforms there. And so Schmidt pushes him on this, and then Bai responds in a piece in a piece on Talking Points memo, where he says what he means to say by that is that if we were designing a system from scratch today, we would not design the system of social security that we have. And this seems to me to be pretty plausible, a pretty reasonable point. But what it completely leaves out, of course, is that getting a thing like social security today, or any reasonable reforms through the current political system are more or less completely impossible without a fundamental democratic breakthrough on the level of what FDR did back in the period of the Depression. And this seems to me to be a slightly strange thing for somebody who clearly is deeply savvy about politics. Getting policy pushed through when you have so many veto points in the system is really, really difficult.
Very
point
difficult.
Of impossibility, and if you start opening up this stuff, you really run the risk of getting nothing whatsoever, because you get rid of the system that you have, but you don't have enough strength to push through a new system.
There was an element in Matt Bai's book of if Democrats won't take on the old bureaucracies and old 1930s systems of social support, then they're not serious. He has in there a metaphor which I thought was kind of clever, but when I first read it, about I forget the term, but in the software business,
the backward compatibility.
A piece of software has to be compatible with the old system, or you can't sell it. So Microsoft. Vista has to be compatible with Microsoft, 2000, and it leads to all kinds of bugs and problems and bad software. And that's true, but the human body is a backward compatible system. Our backs are. If one were designing an upright mammal, you wouldn't design it with the lower back that we have. We have the lower back of all the previous mammals who walked on all fours, and it doesn't work very well. Yet humans do okay, and it reminds me of the arguments I had back a year ago with some of my liberal friends who said, we live in an age where democracy is fundamentally broken, and the Senate is terrible, and it's 60 votes, and places like the western states that have no people get 2 Senate seats, and New York and has more. All this stuff about the failings of the electoral college and so forth, and it's all true. It's all true. There's these aspects of our system that are ridiculous and undemocratic, and yet in 2006 we had a sweep. Republicans were gone. I know it took a lot of mendacity and incompetence to get there, but it did. The system ultimately did work, and the question is, do you really seriously need to redo the Constitution to go forward with some positive reforms, or do you really need to redo all of Social Security to do something serious and positive about growing wage instability? I guess the answer I would give is no, you don't. And as you said, it's kind of a diversion. You'll wind up possibly doing damage to a flawed but quite useful institution and get nothing in return.
Well, 2 quick responses. One is, so I think that one of the big mistakes that was made over the last few years, and this is something I've changed my mind completely on after reading Tom Gagan's book on labor law, was that the Democrats should have allowed the Republicans in the Senate to go ahead with the nuclear option. I would have liked to have seen, in retrospect, the 60 vote threshold being blown up, and being blown up in a way that the Republicans effectively couldn't complain because they had done it. More broadly, I think one of the real problems here is that we don't have, at least in the policy community, very good tools to think about institutional change, when institutional change is possible and when it isn't. And there's one exception to this, which is one of the things that I'm going to propose we link to, which is Jacob Hacker, when he's not writing about policy, really writes some very brilliant stuff about institutional change and when it happens, when it doesn't. And he has a wonderful piece in the American Political Science Review, which is available in various forms on the internet, basically talking about how you try to change within a system, how the Republicans have sought, that they weren't able to attack Social Security directly, so they create all of these, they push through all of these policy measures which are designed to create a sort of an independent system of pensions and of savings and individual insurance in the hope that this will replace it eventually. And what this really gets across is the fact that we aren't living in a map-by universe where you can basically blow things up and then remold the world closer to the heart's desire, or however that old poem goes. You've got to work with the system that you're in, and that requires you to be very realistic about the kinds of institutional changes you can make, the kinds you can't, and what circumstances major groundbreaking reforms are going to be possible under. And I didn't see that in the Pi book, which was otherwise, as I say, I think a really smart, insightful view of what had been happening in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and I think we should leave it on a positive note with the Pi book, which I really do think was a really terrific piece of reporting, and really for anyone, even people who follow that stuff very closely, he really told you the inside stuff that you didn't know. Yeah,
very definitely.
Well, speaking of books, we should probably touch on John Chait's book, which you read and I didn't. And this is the book, The Big Con, which Kevin Drum also reviewed for the Washington Monthly. Although I did read the cover story in the New Republic about it, and he makes a kind of a sort of similar argument, or kind of a partner argument here in that book about the singular power of crackpot economics in defining Republican behavior and Republican sort of power.
Well, my take on it is that first of all, I think that a lot of what he's saying in this is what he says in that piece is more or less entirely on the money.
And can you just very slowly very quickly give us the gist of what the book argues?
So the book is it's a general take on how the Conservatives and how the Republicans have managed to move us away, and this is the bit that I disagree with, which I'll talk about in a minute, move us away from a system in which you basically had sort of moderates in which you had a centre where moderates more or less cooperated with each other, where you had a sort of genuine expertise in the policy process, and they've managed to move us into a system where Republicans are extreme, are partisan, have managed to inject crazy economic ideas into the debate, have managed to work the media, because the media doesn't realise that we're not living in a on the one hand, on the other hand kind of universe anymore,
right.
and
That's
how
totally
the
true.
how the system has been completely supine about this. Anyway, I think that it's also a very good book. I think Chait has some personal issues with people again in the netroots, which I think cause a couple of places in the books where he mentions them to be pretty off kilter from my point of view. But I also think that there's stuff in the book which people from the netroots, people like Duncan Black, could read and enjoy and genuinely profit from. I think that the standout chapter for me is the chapter on the media. He really manages to nail the ways in which the media basically helped sink the Al Gore campaign. He does it in a clearer, more concise, crisp and intelligent way, summarising a whole bunch of stuff which I think has been out there in the blogosphere and elsewhere, but really manages to make it into a convincing and compelling case. I think the piece that was summarised in New Republic is also very good. The piece of the book is also very good, but I think is less original because there he's basically working from Paul Krugman's peddling prosperity arguments, and it's kind of hard to beat Krugman. Being Krugman when it comes to analysing the craziness and the wackiness of supply-side economics.
Right. Well, you mentioned Paul Krugman. That gives us a segue into the another segment of today's Blogging Heads TV, and that is, I'd like to do a kind of post-Times Select look at the op-ed page of the New York Times, everybody can now read the New York Times for free, as has been mentioned many times, and David Brooks today. We're taping this on Friday the 29th.
Before we get into this, would I just be able to make another quick 30-second point about the change? Sorry. The bit I disagree with is the overall framing of the book. Basically, he frames this as being the Republicans having blown up a system which was much more sensible, which was much more based on moderation, much more based upon centrists getting together and agreeing over stuff. And I think that the critique part of the book is great, but this implied contrast that goes through the book, I really have a lot of problems with, because I think he glorifies the old system, which was corrupt in its own particular ways, and he does so, really, I think, kind of realizing around the edges that, some of the arguments that he's making don't work. So that, for example, he basically wants us to get back into a world where journalists behave in a, where journalists can do on the one hand, on the other hand, kind of reporting, and actually have something to it. But he also recognises in passing that journalists have very strong economic interests of their own, which propel them in certain ways that don't necessarily reflect reality. And so I think that he creates this sort of glorified ideal of the way the world used to be, which I think doesn't really reflect how the world ever was. It was a world which I'm sure was much more comfortable for people writing for the New Republic, but I don't think it's a world which had many of the virtues that he said he had. So I just wanted to say that as my disagreement. I think it's a very, very interesting and good book in many ways, but I fundamentally disagreed with the framing of it. So anyway, back to New York Times Select.
Yes, again, apologies for jumping the gun here. Well, I was about to launch into a tirade about the latest David Brooks column. I don't know if you read it. It's the
I have, yeah.
I have to say I read David Brooks as most people do, and it's a kind of weird vice. You read him, and there are times you say, this guy is just very clever. When he's and Nick Confessori, by the way, wrote the ultimate, I thought, dissection of the David Brooks style, or certainly an early and good one for the Washington Monthly. And he made the point that, when he's a sociologist trying to assess the mores of modern America, he's got a wonderful eye and a wonderful prose style, but it is so often marred by the political hack in him that it's so infuriating. And today, the argument that drove me crazy was he's saying that I don't want to get too wonky on this, but it was an attack on the bill before Congress on expanding health care, the S-chip bill for children, and he says oh, this is a terrible step because we're expanding entitlements at a time when we should be restricting entitlements, and it does so in a dishonest way because it's funded through taxes on cigarettes. And gosh, people who smoke cigarettes are people who have low incomes and low self-esteem, and this is a tax that the Democrats aren't brave enough to raise taxes generally on, so it's going to go almost as a kind of regressive tax. There's one line in there about how, yes, it's true that Republicans have made it hard to raise taxes, and that's bad, but it's a kind of slight CYA to the fact that the reason that the only way you can expand health care coverage is to do it through a sin tax, precisely because the Republicans have, as John Chait points out in his book, made the raising of taxes, which is something the old-style Republicans didn't do, verboten, something you cannot bring up. You'll never, ever get Republicans, or at least you haven't been able to be for many years, to consider raising taxes, broadly speaking. And so Democrats and those who would like to expand health care for children must resort to sin taxes like cigarettes. But for God's sakes, it's cigarettes. It's something you should be taxing heavily. It's a horrible killer product, and I don't know for a fact, but I'll bet if you checked it out, you'd find that it is still a progressive move to tax cigarettes to provide health care for low-income kids. I'll bet the average family that benefits from the S-chip is slightly less wealthy than the average smoker. But be that as it may, I just thought it was, classic, twisted David Brooks.
I think that's right, and I don't read him anymore, and I don't read him because I find him more annoying than many other conservative columnists, precisely because I think he can do better. So if I get the sense of somebody, so you can sneer at him, and one of my friends, Scott McLamee, had a very good one-liner about him being an amateur sociologist. That is somebody who, when he reads the New York Times, makes mental footnotes, and that's a little bit unfair, but it also captures something about his modus operandi. But he seems to me to be somebody who's can genuinely be a smart, thoughtful person, but who very often writes what he wants to write or writes what he writes because it's whatever fits in with the broader agenda of the conservative movement, rather than because it's something that he himself personally deeply holds or deeply believes. And it just, when I read conservatives, I prefer people like, my favourite conservative columnist is Clive Crook, who writes for the Financial Times and for a couple of other places. And he's somebody who, I'm never quite sure what to expect, but I'm pretty sure that what he says is actually what he believes. And with Brooks, I just don't, a lot of the time I don't get that impression.
As I said, still have the vice of reading him. And he is read. And just so that people don't think we're only picking on the right-wing side of the New York Times editorial page, we at the Washington Monthly have a piece in the current October issue called "Is Bob Herbert Boring?", in which we pick on the standard bearer of kind of liberalism, more or less, on the Times editorial page, columnist Bob Herbert. I don't know if you had a chance to read that piece.
I've read the piece. I'm probably not the best person to comment on this because I don't really read the New York Times op-ed people with very much anymore. Partly because when they went Time Select, I just, like many other people, couldn't be bothered to pay the $40 or $50 a year that it cost to do this. I used to read Krugman religiously, partly because back in 2001, 2002, he seemed to be the only person with, say, major mainstream media perch that actually seemed to be analysing things in a way that accorded with the way that I myself felt about stuff. But even Krugman I don't read as much anymore because it feels to me like a lot of the time, he's articulating the collective wisdom that you find in the blogs and elsewhere.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
I agree with that. We I think it was another Nick Compstory piece, did a very kind of appreciative profile of Paul Krugman back, I don't know, several years ago when elite opinion was that he was too strident. Remember that?
Yeah, that was a really great piece.
I'm a fan of Krugman. I do think that, he's at a disadvantage now. A lot of the best commentary really is on the blog, but I think he does a great job. And the piece that we wrote on Bob Herbert was not a criticism of Bob Herbert's positions per se. In fact, Tom Frank, T.A. Frank, the author of the piece, really went out of his way to point out how Bob Herbert has been right about everything, much more right than more or less anyone else on the Times editorial page. Certainly far more right than Tom Friedman and David Brooks on the war, on economics. He was way ahead on all kinds of outrages regarding judicial injustices and so forth. And he's not all that surprising of a kind of doctrinaire liberal. He's been very, very critical of some of the clownishness and over-the-top identity politics among African American leaders and so forth. He's really, does reporting. He's one of the few columnists who goes out there and does his own reporting, and yet nobody reads him. And Tom tried to analyze the mystery, solve the mystery of why nobody read him. And I won't bore the readers with the whole story. You should read it because it's a wonderful story. But the truth is, people don't read Bob Herbert nearly as often as they read Paul Krugman or David Brooks or Tom Friedman or Maureen Dowd. And it's partially that he covers, issues of the disadvantaged and poverty and so forth, which elite readers have to strain to make themselves read. But it's partially because he doesn't really frame things in a way that,
Yeah. That's the part. So I think there are two things. First of all, the poverty thing, and which is and I've got to say, this is one of the reasons I really admire John Edwards' campaign, is because it is trying to make that into an issue that is a major issue again. But most people in the middle and upper middle classes turn off. But the second thing, as you say, is the framing thing, and this is something I observe myself as a blogger. When I write a piece that can easily be framed in terms of Republicans versus Democrats in the United States, then that piece gets lots and lots of comments from people who clearly feel that they can fit it easily into their mental universe. When I write something that's on a topic which isn't necessarily more esoteric, but isn't something that easily can be slotted into that particular kind of debate, then by and large people tend not to comment. It's
right. Well, and I think that is the disadvantage that he's working from, given the territory he works. And I've seen that many times with pieces that we've tried to publish. But nevertheless, James Fallows once defined the job of a journalist as making what's important interesting. And that is the job that Bob Herbert has. It's to make his beat interesting to his readers. And it's a hard thing to do. But I think there are ways he could do it better. And part of it is to figure out the passions of his readers, to recognize that some of his issues can be put into a larger political context in ways that are interesting. They give you an example that T.A. Frank mentions in the piece. On subsequent days, both Bob Herbert and Paul Krugman wrote about the issue of S-chip, which we were talking about earlier. Bob Herbert wrote and said, "It's an outrage that poor kids don't have health care." That was the basic theme of the piece. Paul Krugman began his piece with a very kind of interesting comparison with public education. He said, imagine an argument that said, if you don't have the money to have your kids in elementary school, well, that's too bad. It's not the public's, job to make sure your kid gets an education. And it wasn't a totally novel, comparison, but it was an interesting one, and he was able to talk about the S-chip issue, the same issue Bob Herbert was talking about, in just a way that engaged his elite readers a little bit more. And that's what I wish that Herbert would do.
Yeah, and Paul Krugman, I mean, it's fascinating how somebody who is a first-rate economist has become a first-rate polemicist as well. He really seems to have a knack and an instinct for framing things in that kind of way. But to get back to the argument about big ideas that we were having a little while ago, I wonder whether the future might actually create a sort of a set of debates which is a little more congenial for the stuff that Herbert is trying to do. Because it seems to me that there is, if there are quote big ideas happening at the moment, they're happening around the area of inequality. You know, here I'm thinking about Paul Krugman's forthcoming book. Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson are also working on a book project. They presented a first draft skeletal chunk of it at the APSA. There's a lot of economists writing about it, political scientists such as Larry Bartels, and I get the impression that this is really beginning to bubble up into a real political debate, which is where people are actually beginning to pay attention to this a little more, and something like that sort of may help on the demand side for Herbert, which is to say the supply side clearly has to figure out better ways of framing things, but the demand side may be that if people actually begin to think about this in political ways again, instead of as being sort of a policy topic that they can't really do very much about, so they just switch to the next page of the paper, that maybe Bob Herbert will find it easier to get his message heard.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, if look, we do have the potential in 2009 of having a moment where really quite dramatic big thing. You know, we talk about big ideas, but some very major changes could happen very quickly. If the Democrats if the country elects a Democratic president, and enough Democrats win in the Senate, that you can, with the help of a handful of moderate Republicans, get the 60 votes you need to pass some major legislation, you could see major changes in the tax code. You could see universal health care of some sort. You could see some basic changes in training and things like wage insurance and so forth, expansion of the EITC. It could happen rather suddenly in a way that I don't think people are prepared for. And, you're seeing, even among CEOs, and Chris Hayes had a piece a few months ago saying that in the Washington Monthly, that, you have CEOs now moving to a position where they're already smelling that the power is going to change in Washington. They're seeing that it's more and more difficult to provide health care to their employees. They're seeing global warming being an issue which they're going to have to deal with down the road. They're seeing unregulated Chinese factories undercutting them, and recognizing that maybe they do need some regulation from Washington. So, the Fortune 500 part of the business community, it looks like it's going to be more amenable to an expansion of government power and spending. And I don't think the conservatives have a clue that this is coming. And or if they do, they're being pretty mum about it. And I don't want to make any predictions. I don't know that this is going to happen, but you could see something very, very big happen in a couple of years.
I think that's right, and from my own perspective as an international political economy person, this is stuff that I do as Abe Newman at Georgetown. I think that international regulation is going to become a major, major issue, and I think that the US, because of the last 10 or 20 years, has managed to position itself very badly on this stuff. If you look at where international regulations are made, they are not made in Washington, D.C. The kind of product safety regulations that govern international markets are made in Brussels by the European Union. And this is something which, which is a product, I think, in large part of the fact that the European Commission, so its bread and butter is passing regulations because it doesn't have very much in the way of political clout apart from that. And in the US, the emphasis has been on deregulation, self-regulation, all of these things which, if you're a conservative, sound very nice in principle, but in practice mean that the bottom floor of international regulation, the lowest common denominator, is being set by the Europeans, and naturally the interests of European business gets pushed into that process. So I think that not only is this happening on the domestic front, I think it's happening on the international front as well, and I think we're going to see a lot more international pressure for more regulation as a result of this.
Yeah, no, I think you could be right. And so we shall see. Big stuff coming. Wanted to kind of just get your thoughts on a more base political issue, and that is the Democratic primary. Hillary Clinton, she seems to have come out of this latest debate. I didn't watch it, but different views of it. But she seems to continue to rack up points and solidify her lead role. On the other hand, there's some problems that she's run into. What are your views on Hillary?
Okay, well, my views on Hillary, I don't do the horse race stuff because I think I'm pretty bad at that. I'm a political scientist, or I claim to be a political scientist. That isn't the kinds of political science that I do, so I feel that my punditry on this kind of stuff is third or fourth rate punditry, partly because I'm not connected into the right gossip circuits, partly because I'm not American, so there are certain things about the American political system that I just simply don't get. But yes, my take on the merits of Hillary, I think that she's clearly a pretty smart, competent person. I think that she is more and more coming out of the shadow of Bill Clinton, who clearly is much more charismatic than her, and I think also probably is brighter than her, but in ways which didn't necessarily conduct all that well in terms of creating coherent policy. The old sort of crack about FDR was that he was a second-rate intellect and a first-rate temperament. I think Bill Clinton had a first-rate intellect and a second-rate temperament in terms of being able to sort of really deliver upon his intellectual gifts in the policy process. I don't think that a Hillary Clinton administration would be a bad thing, but I think it would be a kind of unexciting thing. Personally, I would prefer to see somebody like John Edwards get in, because I think that on all of the stuff of inequality, he has much more positioned himself to take up that bully pulpit if he did manage to get in. Barack Obama, I would also prefer, but I certainly would not be averse to Hillary Clinton. But let's get back. I think there's a specific story that you have an interest in about Hillary, and maybe you can talk about that.
Well, yeah, I just, I kind of disagree and think Hillary would be a terrific president and a lot more activist and probably more successful in getting things done than you would think. But we shall see. But I think she did herself a little bit of damage this past week by. And it wasn't her, it was so much her staff. There's a small story that maybe didn't get a lot of attention, but is personal to me because a guy who used to work for me, Josh Green, now at the Atlantic, brilliant reporter, had a piece in GQ that about Hillary and some spats on her staff that someone on her staff went to GQ. This is the story in Politico about this. I don't know, all the details about it. I know what Politico said, and what they said was that they were able to force the editor of GQ to. GQ had also gotten an okay from President Bill Clinton to do a big cover story interview with him, and they said if you want the interview with Bill Clinton, you've got to kill the piece on Hillary's staff, and so GQ did, and it was in Politico. And I just thought it was an amazingly dumb move on Hillary's staff's part, because GQ is not the most well-read. It's a nice, big, handsome, and well-respected publication, but in political circles, it's not one that many people read. And the piece will land somewhere else. So, you can't just kill a piece and think that it's going to then not go anywhere. Josh Green is not somebody who's going to back down and say, "Oh gosh, I guess I've run afoul of the
powers of Hillary."
Powers of Hillary. He's going to, I'm sure, publish it somewhere else. And then there's going to be that story, and he probably will publish it in a publication that is more read by political reporters. And there's a meta story about sort of the rough and kind of ruthless tactics of the Hillary campaign, and so I thought it was very unwise, and I was sad to see it. But I hope GQ at least paid Josh Kilby.
I would hope so too. It seems to me that, first of all, I think the Hillary campaign has been ruthless on this stuff. So I know from stories of people I know who've said sort of impolitic things about the Clinton campaign in public, and then have been told by people, so that they can expect to suffer for that afterwards if she gets into power. But so I can also, I think that this was strategically a very, very dumb thing to do. But I can also understand a little bit about the motivation for why she might have wanted to do this, which is that, or why people around her might have wanted to do this, which is that much of the source of the success of the campaign of the Hillary campaign has been this perception that it's this ruthless, monolithic, extraordinarily efficient juggernaut. And the particular story that Josh Green was going to tell was a story about fractiousness and divisiveness within the campaign, which might have to some extent gotten at that sort of image of vulnerability that clearly she has been building on, that image of inevitability, which I think has helped her rack up a whole pile of endorsements. But more generally, so I think that this kind of behaviour is something which I used to get extremely pissed off about when I saw Republicans doing it. There's clearly been a lot of message manipulation happening during the Bush administration, where you saw people, sort of some extremely prominent journalists like Bob Woodward, who very clearly to me were sort of pulling their punches because they felt that they were going to have their access removed unless they said nice, friendly things. That pissed me off then. I think it's a bad thing for democracy that these cozy relationships, or these relationships of authority and of back-scratching or of threatening happen between powerful political figures and journalists. And I think it pisses me off when people on my own side, and Hillary I think is somebody on my own side, does it too.
Well, and I can understand that, and I think that's the thing that the Hillary folks have to deal with, and let me just say, I think that there may be something to your argument about the sort of sense of juggernaut, but my time in the Clinton administration, at the end of the Clinton administration, in the height of the Monica thing, I mean, the people around the President Clinton and Senator Clinton, and I'm sure that they too have a sense that the press, has never really given them a break. That the expectation of fair treatment is ridiculous. You're never going to get it. In the White House, we had okay relationship with the press. I didn't personally work that beat, but I was a speechwriter. But the aim of our communications department was always to go over the heads of the political press here in Washington and talk directly to local TV stations and talk radio and newspapers in the regions and small towns and so forth. And if anyone has the right to think, I'm never going to get a fair treatment from the mainstream Washington press, it's Hillary Clinton. And so I don't blame her or her staff one iota for taking an approach to the media, especially watching the way the Republicans did it and got away with it, and saying, well, if you want to make change is a difficult thing to do, and it requires a kind of ruthlessness, and we're going to do the same to the press that the Bush administration did because it worked for them. And I think that's the attitude, and I'm really torn about that. As a member of the press, I don't like it. As a former Clintonite, I understand it. I haven't really totally formulated my thoughts about it, but my kind of inner self says it can't work for a Democrat as well as it worked for a Republican. And I'm not sure why, and I can't really defend that right now, but I think that's probably what I think. And certainly I believe in this case it was a ridiculous mistake. It will, I predict, not serve Hillary Clinton to have tried to kill this story. And I think her staff did her an injustice.
Yeah, well, maybe sort of to meet you part way on this, I think that I think you probably are right that Democrats cannot get away with this in the way that Republicans can, and I think part of that has to do with sort of simply the expectations that the press have of Democrats vis-a-vis Republicans. So that a certain amount of manipulation on the part of Republicans is par for the course. I think because there's more sort of palliness, or because perhaps because Democrats are supposed to be more committed to these kinds of values of fair, sort of free speech and press and whatever. I think it's tougher for Democrats to it is going to be tougher for Democrats to get away with it, and probably well, I don't know whether this is going to become a major controversy or not, but certainly it's something which might snowball later in a way in which it might not have had it been say the Giuliani campaign, who had tried to pull a similar stunt.
I agree. And let's, one other thing that Hillary did I guess yesterday was when asked the question, are you if the Cubs and the Yankees get into the World Series, are you going to root for one or the other? And she said, gosh, I'll probably, root for each of them on alternate days. And she's taking some hazing for that. Of course, Hillary was born and raised in Chicago and is now the senator from New York. And it was it was a kind of classic politician's answer.
Splitting the baby.
Yeah, but I have to say I have some sympathy for her. My wife is a dyed-in-the-wool Boston Red Sox fan, and my 11-year-old son Adam is a fierce Cubs fan, and we could see a Sox-Cubs World Series too. And in that case, I'm a Cardinal fan, and the Cardinals are not even are out of the running for even the wild card. So I like both teams. I'm not a hater of the Cubs. Cubs tend to be haters of Cardinals, and not the other way around, because Cardinals win and Cubs don't. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. But if faced with a Cubs Yankees series, I don't know, who do I side with, my wife or my son? It's tough.
Well,
I'll cheer both sides, and hug those who lose.
You think you've got it tough. I'm terrified. I'm an Irish immigrant to the United States. My son is 20 months old. Sooner or later, he's going to start caring about these things, and I don't understand. I get which end of the baseball bat to hold. That's about as far as my knowledge of this extends. Because the sports I grew up with were, Irish sports that you wouldn't have heard of, such as hurling and Gaelic football, soccer and rugby. I guess you would have heard of, but these things are all a vast mystery to me. So I once had a friend explain the rules of American football to me, but I regret to say drunk at the time, so it didn't take. Baseball, I'm afraid I'm terrified that when my son gets older and starts asking Daddy what is happening, I don't know what the hell I'm going to say to him.
Well, my advice to you, my friend, is to become your son's soccer coach. He'll love you, and at a young age they love soccer more than baseball. The baseball thing, in my experience, kicks in a little bit later, and that gives you 4 or 5 years to learn the game of baseball. So
okay.
you're actually in very good shape as long as you hew to the sport of your people.
Okay, well, so now I can also pretend to have spurious authority on Gaelic football and these other topics, which I guess he's never really going to see in the flesh. So
get him, make him the champion hurler in his high school, and that's they love that in the the college administrators, the college admissions people love that. So
yeah, I guess that actually
any as you can.
They won't understand what it is, but they'll figure out it's cute, it's kind of vaguely ethnic, and it's,
there you go. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They love that stuff.
Yeah.
Good. Hey, this has been great fun. We didn't disagree on very much.
I guess we didn't, but I think we had a couple of good arguments nonetheless. So yeah.
Good. And thus ends another edition of the award-winning Blogging Heads TV. Thank you, Henry.
And thank you, Paul.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.